So, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Garrison Institute's Pathways to Planetary Health Forum. I'm Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute. Before we begin today's session, let's review a few logistical items. We are on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio, that means your audio, will remain and video remain off for the duration of the webinar. Please write any questions you have in the Q&A box, and I will be monitoring it, and if they make sense, I'll incorporate it into the dialogue. We're recording these sessions, and you'll have a chance to view the recording, as well as a schedule of upcoming programs and past recordings at garrisoninstitute.org. This is an interactive online event as part of our Pathways to Planetary Health Forum 2024 series, in which we explore topics like regeneration, earth wisdom, across 4 pathways: common good, ecological civilizations, regenerative economies, and biodiversity stewardship. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dekila Chungyalpa. How do I best pronounce that? I want to get it right.
Chungyalpa. You can separate all the syllables out.
Ooh, great. Dekila Chungyalpa. Dekila is the founder and director of the Loka initiative. She's an accomplished environmental program director with 20 years or more of experience designing and implementing global conservation and climate strategies and projects. And I've known her for much of those 20 years. Known as an innovator in the environmental field, she has expertise in faith-led environmental and climate partnerships, biodiversity, landscape, and river basin strategy design, and community-based conservation. She began her career in 2001 working on community-based conservation in the Eastern Himalayas with the World Wildlife Fund, where she grew up. She's originally from the Himalayan state of Sikkim, which I believe is the only country in the world that is 100% organic in its food production. She's of Bhutan origin. She received the Yale McCluskey Award in 2014 for her work and moved to the Yale School of Environmental Studies as an associate research scientist, where she developed the ideas for the work that we're going to be talking about today. So welcome, Dekila.
Hi, Jonathan. It's lovely to be here and to be talking with you. We've known each other for so long. It's hard to sort of do the formal Dashidalek, and I'm so pleased to be here, but I really am.
But you see, that's that way we don't have to we can invite people really into our conversation.
That's right.
So growing up in Sikkim, so describe Sikkim. I had a conversation earlier today with a bunch of people who are really concerned about Bhutan. And somebody said, quoted a Bhutanese named Kinley Dorje as saying,
yes,
very hard to be a GNH country, gross national happiness country, in a GDP world, in a gross.
absolutely.
Right. And so you grew up in Sikkim in a time when it was still sequestered from the world and it was less penetrated by the global economy. So describe what it was like.
Right. So I had a normal childhood. I should mention my dog is in the room with me. So if you hear any background noise, it's my dog. But I had a childhood where I grew up in a family of Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. And both my grandmother and later my mother took their vows when I was young. And so I was raised by Tibetan Buddhist nuns. And I grew up being with my mother as she made choices and chose to be in very remote parts of Sikkim. So I grew up for at least 4 or 5 years of my childhood in the west of Sikkim in Pemayangsi, which was absolutely wild at that time. We had 2 main roads that connected the area we lived in. And I grew up in, what we often describe as pristine. Of course, there is actually no pristine state of wilderness, but I grew up in wilderness, and I grew up having a lot of seeing nature and seeing wildlife around me and being raised to understand that these are equally, important non-human living species that have rights just like we do. So I have started using an example that was actually brought up by a friend of mine, a childhood friend of mine who's a Bhutia scholar, Kazam Bhutia, who mention that in West Sikkim, we don't say the name of the species. So for example, Himalayan black bear, the word for it is dhom, which in Tibetan and Bhutia language is the same. But in Sikkim, we would say akudhom, which means uncle bear. So we're sort of raised with this idea that we are related in some way or the other to wildlife species and to all other living beings. And it showed in the way I was raised, and it showed in the way we lived, right? It was incredibly simple. I grew up where plastic bags were so treasured because they were so rare that we would reuse them, fold them, put them under the bed to keep them smooth, and then take them out when we needed it, I grew up when you almost saw no disposable garbage. I think I saw my first Coke can when I was 13 and I was in boarding school. That was the first time I saw it. So it meant that I grew up in what we can now talk about. When we talk about degrowth, I grew up in a community and in an economy that really was circular. And that really is what, whenever I imagine degrowth, that it exemplified that in the best possible way, where you had enough to survive on and to thrive on, but you didn't have enough where there was this extreme case of inequality or extreme cases of poverty. And when I did my master's here at the US, I chose to go back and look at how economic development had impacted the culture in Sikkim. And one of the things I noticed, and it was such a stark difference, was that my community, like many indigenous communities, have certain traditions in place that really are about sharing responsibility and economic burdens. And so when someone is pregnant or there is a marriage, the whole community comes in and gives things that are needed to have that celebration. So growing up, when my aunts were about to bear children, the community would come, stop by, and they would bring hens or eggs or vegetables or just bags of rice. It would just get dropped off in the house. We would know which household donated it. And it's understood that when their time comes, we're doing the same thing. And one of the most obvious differences I saw when I was doing my master's research was that the things that were being donated, the gifts had changed. So all of a sudden, the nature of gifts were cakes. We suddenly had cakes coming in from the cities. We had bakeries that were opening up, that were franchises, and all of a sudden people were demonstrating their love and affection for one another, but through food items that actually had no nutritional value, that actually didn't bring health benefits to the people they were being given to, right? But what it did do was demonstrate a kind of modernization, and I have to say it had become a status symbol. So in my lifetime, what I've seen is that experience of growing up in a very remote part of the Himalayas where communities are still intact, and every aspect of communal life is about reciprocity and relationships, right? To now, all of us driving our very fancy imported cars and sort of really living for this consumeristic lifestyle that I think we think denotes a kind of superiority. When actually the way we lived in the past probably, in terms of quality of life, was more superior.
So what's the pathway forward that is a pathway? So by the way, what you've described is beautiful. And it's clear that your life as a child was not a life of suffering.
No,
but,
no.
So what's the pathway? Can we recreate? So you've just crystallized the whole issue. So in this modern westernized world, can we actually create a system of true mutuality and reciprocity?
Mm-hmm. I believe so, yes. I believe so partly because for all kinds of reasons, the first thing that comes to mind is probably what everyone who is of South Asian origin is thinking about, which is the recent Indian elections, right? What we saw was a complete refutation of the the journey as it was presented to us by all the experts, all the media experts, all the political economists, all the the heads of different news agencies, which is that we were going to see a massive win from what is more or less turning into a religious fascist party.
Right.
And that this is their third term coming in, and that it was a given that India is on this journey. We are turning into, India is turning into a fascist country, and that it is a done deal. There is no turning back. And what we actually saw is that they almost lost. They came this close to losing, which really, I think, really emphasizes the point that it's never too late. Change is the nature of all things. Everything is fluid. Everything is impermanent. We can always improve ourselves. And I love the fact that this is a teaching that I get from nature, and it's a teaching I get from Buddhism, right? We are designed to evolve. We are designed to continually evolve, which means we get to retrace our tracks. We just need to drop the hubris and be able to say, okay, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we need to take a few steps back. I think that part is a necessary part of the journey. And I do think contemplative practices really help us do that inner work that is required. But I feel like we're at this point right now. It is this incredible convergence of movements and ideas, and I would say thought leaders. I've never had so many people that are saying things that are similar enough to what I believe, right? I think I've said this to you before, there were moments in my career, in my life, where I literally felt like I was the only person who thought that inner resilience was relevant to community resilience, and community resilience was relevant to planetary resilience, that I couldn't see these three things as separate silos. And it amazed me that we were approaching it as three different, unconnected goals. And now, wherever I look, I see there is this sort of common resurgence. All of us are reclaiming this understanding and this worldview. And I have to say, so much of it is because of indigenous leaders that have been generously sharing their wisdom with all of us all this time, mostly thanklessly. And I think it really also is largely due to young people who see the world without the rose-colored glasses that was bequeathed to my generation, thanks to Ronald Reagan. We sort of were given a worldview when we were in university and when we graduated, right? We had this idea that it's capitalism or bust, and capitalism is one way or the other going to fix itself. You just need to be patient. If it has kinks, the process itself, the method is actually sound, and it will reverse the kinks, right? It will fix itself. And that capitalism will actually bring us all out of poverty. And it is the great equalizing equation for humanity. And I think the youth just look at that and laugh at it, because the last 30 years has shown us how much capitalism has failed. So I feel like this combination of young people just rejecting that outright and saying, well, that's not even my idea of success or what I want my life to equate to. And I think a lot of organizations, institutions, Garrison is very much foremost in there, they really question this and want to think deeper about, well, how do we create a world where we all get to be equal, we all get to thrive, and we're not dominating one another to do that, right? So it is, however difficult it is, because it is scary. As you know, last year, I think, was the first 12 months we've had where we crossed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in terms of global warming, 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is 2.7 degree Fahrenheit. So it is a scary moment, but it's also a moment. Oh, my dog feels very strongly about this. It is also
a moment. You
moment.
let your dog out? Is he okay?
She is fine. She's just, hold on one second. I'll be right back.
See, this is about humans and nature as being intertwined.
We have hounds next door. Our neighbor owns hounds, and so whenever they bay, it sets her off. So I've just sort of released her out. So as I was saying, but I think it's also this great moment of hope because so many of us agree with one another and so many of us are sort of locked arm in arm, right, as we move forward.
So let's talk about some of the, so you're now running the Loka initiative, which is at University of Wisconsin, and it's housed within Richie Davidson's group. So it's a real opportunity to integrate the nature-based solutions and the environmental work you've been doing all your life with the neuroscience that Richie's been doing all his life. So let's talk about that integration. What are you learning from his side, and what is he learning from your side?
So it's amazing. I love it so much. I have to tell you, being at the Center for Healthy Minds. So Loka, the way Richie, I, John Dunn, Jonathan Pats, Paul Robbins, there were several of us who came together to design Loka. It's a partnership across campus with 7 other institutes and schools. So we have access to faculty from all these different institutes, obviously environment, but also public health, gender, religious, global religious citizenship, and so on. So there's a whole variety of them. And I think the beauty of being housed at the Center for Healthy Minds is that what I'm discovering is there is really a commonality of what we think about well-being, what we think about resilience, and that it applies not just in psychological or neurological terms, but it applies to us socially, and it applies to us ecologically as well. And so for me, the beauty of being at CHM, the Center for Healthy Minds, is that so often, I hear them talk about things like the epigenetics, right, of trauma. And then I can ask them, well, what is the epigenetics of resilience? And that just opens up this brand new area that we can sort of delve into, where I'm thinking about resilience in terms of what was bequeathed to me in a very personal way from my mother and my grandmother, right? Whether it's genetics or learned or heritage or teachings, all of those things are aspects of resilience that was inherited. But then what does that mean for communities? What does that mean for places like Sikkim that still have intact social fabric? And what does that mean for societies where the social fabric has ruptured, right? We now know loneliness is declared as an epidemic in the United States. Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, declared it last year. And so how do we think about resilience in a social sense? And what is the social epigenetics of resilience? And so I find that we start in one place and it just explodes into this massive, fascinating, multidisciplinary dialogue. And the beauty of it is that we have so much faculty coming and going that it's truly multidisciplinary, We have John Dunn, who is the great Tibetan Buddhist scholar, and we have all these other folks coming in and giving us their perspective. So whatever Loka develops is really, I would say, strengthened by this dialogue and the deeper conversations we're having at the center. Richie and I, of course, are good friends. We've known each other for a long time. I think I have seen this arc with Richie where we started out talking about what are the psychological benefits of nature to human beings, right? The fact that we know that people who, for example, there are studies that show that people who broke their legs heal faster when they have an image of nature in front of them versus people who don't have that image, right? We know that people literally neurologically calm down, they start expressing joy, they experience, I suppose the best way to describe it is a sense of interconnectedness, a sense of centeredness when they are in nature. So there are tons of studies that show that. But I think what we've been able to do together is also integrate that planetary resilience is really relevant to psychological resilience. We are not independent of nature. We are within nature. And so how do we incorporate what is happening environmentally and in terms of climate change into neuroscience and into psychology? And that has allowed us to start a partnership on research. We just launched it this year, and there are two big questions we're looking at together. So Loka Initiative and the Center for Healthy Minds. And the first question is, well, what are people experiencing when they think about environmental degradation and climate collapse? What are the emotions that arise? And do the emotions change depending on who you are? Do the emotions themselves differ, and does the intensity of the emotions differ? Because my hypothesis, and this is also fed from my personal experience, but I would also say professionally, just knowing the number of climate environmental folks I know who talk about the emotional trauma they carry, is that depending on your identity subgroup, you probably have different emotions that rise to the top. And the intensity changes depending on who you are. And it's very logical. Someone who went through Hurricane Katrina, who happens to be Black or happens to have family that were harmed during that time, is going to react differently to hurricanes. As someone who grew up here in the Great Lakes, has never experienced a hurricane in their life, right? It's logical. But what that means is that we are able to better understand emotional well-being when it comes to environmental and climate issues, based on identity subgroups. And then the second question, which is, I hope, where we end up, is what are the resources that benefit people in that case? Do we need to create different kinds of techniques to address these different emotions? And I really draw from my own upbringing. I really draw from having been raised by nuns, the wisdom of Tibetan Buddhism, where completely opposite to the way mindfulness is taught in the West. Actually, the way we are taught Buddhism in the East is that your teacher tailors your practice for you, right? The importance of having a teacher-student relationship is that nobody knows you better than your teacher. And your teacher knows what you can and cannot use as a method. I should say constructively use as a method. We could use every method, but maybe constructively as we evolve spiritually. And so this idea of tailoring practices to who you are, to what your techniques are, to what your preferences are, is a really key part of our research and a very big part of the course that we happen to be launching on Monday, the Psychology of Deep Resilience course on edX. And at the heart of it, I think if there is one, sentence that I have to sum up the research and Loka's approach towards resilience building, it really is that we know ourselves best, and we can mindfully pick the practices that work for us, but we have to put in that time. And so one of my deepest hopes with the course is that it gives people that time to go through these different practices. We're offering 15 different contemplative practices from 3 different wisdom traditions. And so my hope is that people put in the time so that what they get is a very deep, enriched sense of resilience.
So first of all, for the audience, I'll link to the courses in the chat, and let's just focus a little more. So first, and then I want to wind back to some other things you said. But so the course is going to be how many days?
It's asynchronous. You can take it at the pace you want. It's up to you. It's free. edX is available in 70 different countries. It's very low tech, so folks can just use their phones.
Right.
If people want to buy if people want the certificate, they have to buy it. But if people just want the experience, they can do it for free. And it's 4 courses that are embedded. So, each course has 5 modules, which is roughly around a week, I'd say, an hour of video per module. So 5 hours of video viewing.
And just give us so what are some of the practices you're going to teach?
I love them so much. So we have 3 wisdom traditions. So we have Buddhism, we have indigenous land-based healing / nature immersion, and then we have somatics. And I am so excited about the practices that we're offering, because it's a range of teachers, some of whom are really not well known, and some of whom are really up and coming. Many of them are from marginalized communities themselves. And it's also, some of the practices are really meant for you to go grab someone you love and do it with them. So one of the practices we're offering is breath and song, where we're inviting people to sing with a singer who's very well known in Canada, Desiree Dawson, for people who might know her. And we're inviting them to grab somebody they love or somebodies that they know that and use their diaphragm, use their stomach muscles to just burst out and sing and reclaim joy, right? So some of the practices are like that. Some of them are very traditional meditation. So we do have a couple of mindfulness meditations. We have some awareness meditations. I'm reusing one that I had done in the past that's just about interdependence with nature. So it's a whole variety. We have a couple of, we have an indigenous teacher, Brian McInnes, who's offering teachings where he connects 7 grandfather teachings with how to sort of essentially sit with suffering, you know, and sit with all the trauma that whirls around us, right? So how do we access ancestral teachings so that we are resourced for being in a state of crisis? And so it's a whole variety of contemplative practices. And the reason why we do that is because we really believe that you find what works for you. You find what is looking for you, right? And we hope this is where people actually find something that works for them.
Great. Okay, I'm going to wind this back and then I'm going to wind this forward. So one of the things you talked about was you said, so there is psychological trauma and environmental trauma. And you said, what are the epigenetics, not only of trauma, but the epigenetics of resilience? So last night, I had dinner with David Sloan Wilson, an evolutionary biologist. And I said something about the epigenetics of, I was actually talking about the Black Plague, in which in 1448, literally between 48 and 52, literally 50% of Europe died, and people experienced extraordinary traumas. And I was trying to figure out what is the long-range epigenetic effect of it. And what he said was, the epigenetic effect may be 3 generations. So the real effect is not to diminish the epigenetic effect, but is how did that change the psychology of people? And then what culture did they create in response to that? And so the social effect is what is the really enduring thing. But the other thing is the social effect can be changed. So have you been studying social systems? What makes them rigid and what makes them changeable?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I don't consider myself an expert. I do have friends who are systems experts, thankfully. I mean, probably like a lot of other people in this space, I am a big fan of Donella Meadows and was really influenced by how she thought about systems and how she thought about flexibility of systems. And I have to say, when I think about systems and resilience building at a systems level, something that has really, really influenced me is womanists, you know, thinkers and writers and feminists, Black women in particular, Black faith leaders I know, who really made it a point to talk about how resilience can so easily, anything can be co-opted to prop up whatever the supremacies of the moment. And in our society, it's white supremacy and patriarchy. And so how do we do it in such a way? How do we enter social transformation in a way where we don't just sort of get co-opted into that, right? And for me, what that meant was I really had to distinguish between attributes of resilience and conditions of resilience. And I really had to separate these two things out. And so the Loka initiative, we have a framework on deep resilience. We've just submitted it for publishing. And it became really obvious that we have to separate them. Whether we're talking about social resilience or even ecological resilience and definitely inner resilience, that these are 2 different things. And we cannot conflate these 2 very different things, because if we are talking about attributes, maybe it is possible that everybody has access to a certain amount of transformation we can do with our attributes. But if we're talking about conditions, well, that piece is systemic. No, you can put two humans side by side and they will have experienced different conditions of resilience, depending on who they are and what identity subgroup they have, right? And so, as someone, it's interesting too for me that one of the things we do with resilience or with systems change is that we tend to assume that, for example, let's talk about assets, which I think of as a condition for resilience. We kind of assume that everybody needs to have exactly the same assets to thrive. And actually, let me be really clear and say, I grew up very poor. If people had seen the house I grew up in Pemayansi, they would have really thought I am in the poorest category, right? I look back and what I see is that I was really resourced well by my family. I had enough to eat. We lived in a house with a thatched roof that leaked. I had a fantastic education. I was taught meditation at a very young age. And there was a lot of deliberate centering of joy that the adults did for us as children. All the adults in my family did. We had impromptu picnics and riverside, visits, and we were grabbed and taken to Rumtek Monastery every weekend, and we had to sing all along the way, and we had to sing the songs the adults knew. So I can tell you, I know every lyric to every Carpenter song that ever existed. It was kind of like there was this very deliberate resourcing of joy. And it makes me realize how easy it is for us to have blinders when we think about assets. But coming back to conditions, some of these conditions are so systemic. The quality of education, whether you get lunch or not, whether, as kids, if you get lunch or not, redlining in districts, right? Those are all systemic changes that must happen and must be in place for us to talk about the other things about resilience that we want to build.
That's amazing. So let's talk a little bit about joy. And I have in the chat actually the Yale School of Environment, where your McCluskey Fellow is holding its second annual conference this November on environmental justice, and they're calling it Environmental Joy. So, you described earlier how this idea of interdependence, something which used to be, you thought you were the only person seeing the world that way, and now everybody or many, many people are seeing the world that way. So maybe this is a clue that environmental joy is beginning to be seen.
I mean, I don't think I have to be really clear and say, my dog is being very loud. I don't feel like I'm the only person that came up with this idea. I do think it's a convergence. And I think there's something really beautiful. Sometimes, it's the ideas where the time has come, and many of us are almost, we're all in the river moving at the same time, and it feels that way to me. So I didn't know about this conference, and it sounds amazing. And it brings me a lot of joy. It's at Yale to talk about environmental joy.
But here's my point. You're the only two people I've ever heard talk about it, them and you. So we're early days in the idea. But something's happening. Clearly something's happening. So talk more about the idea of environmental joy.
Oh, can you hear my dog, or is it just me?
No, that is Zoom.
Okay, good. Thank God.
Like the perfect
Thank all the gods. Okay, I was worrying about it. So I think the reason why I decided to talk about it so explicitly and make it such a big part of Loka's work and Loka's framework was because this actually really became obvious to me. And again, thanks to so many leaders I know who I adore. Jackie Patterson comes to mind. After the George Floyd murder. And what I saw was that it had never crystallized to me so clearly that when we talk about mindfulness in the West, and when we talk about inner well-being or even spiritual well-being in the West, what we really meant was distress reduction.
Mm.
It had never, it sort of really came to light for me that mm, that there was something quite white supremacist about that we had
Uh-huh.
taken a practice and boiled it down to making us sort of control our distress factor, right? So many of us, what we had done and what we'd been taught to do is curate a safe space in our domicile, put in an orchid or two in there and kind of find the space or go buy products that self-care products, right? Again, very capitalist. Um, and that there was deep inequity in there and injustice in there because as Black or Indigenous or other people of color in America, a lot of us don't get to control the where the distress comes from. We don't get to control the origin point of distress, right? And so that means that kind of practice may or may not work for a lot of folks. Even being able to control the points of distress is a kind of, it is a privilege. And so it sort of showed up around that time to me that, well, what is it then that we do? What do we do for our resilience? What is it that I do for my inner well-being? And what I noticed was what I do is I create joy. Just like my
Mm.
family did for me, I do it for my community and my friends, right? We in Madison, we have lots of potlucks. We have 4 months of winter where it's just freezing, and there's just potluck dinner after potluck dinner. But that there is also what I could suddenly see were all the rituals. So, Loka has a very wonderful project with Native tribes up north here in Wisconsin. Um, and I get to work with and spend time with some indigenous elders up north. And all of a sudden, I was looking at ice fishing and I was looking at wild rice gathering and, tapping, maple tapping, and all of these things, and realizing that these are all livelihoods, food gathering. They're always communal, they're always around food, and they are so uh, they're evolved to be joyful, right?
Right.
Absolutely packed with wisdom and laughter and hilarity and intergenerational joy being passed around.
Yes.
And it became really clear to me that when we think about inner resilience, there are two aspects to it. And so there is the distress reduction and there is the centering of joy.
Mm.
And we don't, especially those of us, I think, who are white or white adjacent or sort of really been put through the science training or the Western education system, we kind of don't know how to center joy. We've forgotten
Right.
how to do it. We're so in our heads. And we tend to fixate on the trauma. We don't fixate as much on the solution, right? The trauma kind of generates its trauma, and we just keep it. It's addictive. I often describe it as it has sticky nature. Its nature is sticky. Once we pick it up, it's sticking to us, right? And
Yes.
so figuring out how we let that go and how we see joy as part of our strategy towards environmental and climate problems is necessary. And again, I'm not the originator of this idea. I really learned it from
No,
other
no, no, I got it.
teachers,
I
you
got it.
know?
You're not the originator, but you're an illuminator of it. And this is fantastic. And it's interesting because indigenous cultures, um, they just are filled with joy. It reminds me of a little story. My wife and I have had a deep connection with the Himalayas, and we started out in Ladakh, and in summer '96 we brought our children there and lived in Ladakh for the summer. Anyway, we were trekking in the mountains, and we we were starting to camp by a river, and we went to the river to wash up. And on the other side of the river was the village and families. So these women and children came to the river. I can't remember who started it first, but they started splashing. And then my daughter started splashing them, and then I'm like, hang back. And then I joined. Anyway, we end up having this hilarious splash fight. Like neither of us spoke each other's languages. We
Yeah.
became best friends on opposite sides of the stream, splashing each other in the summer heat. And you're right, that kind of spontaneous joy, which is so much part of the life of people who live with nature, is so much not part of the life
Yeah.
of who live in cities. Um, So I want to talk about, you've been doing this amazing work with the evangelicals.
Yes.
How did it come about? And and what did you learn? And are they joyful?
Uh, I will say, so I've been working with faith leaders now since 2008. And I have to say, across the board, faith leaders are very joyful. They really understand the language of hope. They really know, they're experts with the language of hope, how to invoke it, right? They're very communal. They're really in good ways and bad ways, right? But they really understand how rituals matter to the community and how it holds communities together. So generally speaking, absolutely. So when I created the way, when I started working with faith leaders, I was still at WWF. I was at the time working in the Greater Mekong region, and I was WWF US's director for the Greater Mekong, and really struggling with eco-anxiety and climate distress. There were no words then. These words didn't exist. They came later, thanks to Susan Clayton and other folks. And so all I knew was I was experiencing these nightmares, and they were recurring and kind of having, night sweats. And I turned to practice, and I turned to my community to help heal myself. And so the work that I began doing with faith leaders was very organic and sort of really meant just for my community. And it exploded in terms of interest. And I ended up getting everybody, different WWF offices wanting to do similar programs. So when the work began, I decided I needed a criteria because there was just me, and I had to fulfill about 40 different offices with different religions who wanted to work with religions. The criteria I decided to use was who isn't in the room already. So who is not being invited to the UN conventions, who doesn't show up, who doesn't feel welcome or doesn't believe in them, who is essentially not in the room. And obviously the evangelicals just came right up. They were sort of the number one group at that time, especially. The only organization I knew that was doing environmental work was EAN, the Environmental Evangelical Network, which is led by Jim Ball and others in DC. So I reached out. And what is fascinating to me about religious leaders is they never refuse meeting you. So I've always had that initial meeting, and then further doors may or may not open, but the first meeting always happens. And we sort of tentatively started this dialogue. It took me 10 years for the dialogue to actually mature and the trust to build enough that we could launch a project together. So the project that we launched here at the Loka Initiative at UW-Madison is called Creation at the Crossroads. My co-facilitator is Reverend Ed Brown, who's a 70-plus-year-old Midwest pastor, done creation care work all his life. And what we do is we bring about 20 church leaders and evangelical pastors every year to Madison behind closed doors. We sign a contract. Nobody reveals what happens in there. And in those 4 days, there is a dialogue between scientists and faith leaders. And we almost always have a couple of climate denialists in the room. It's fascinating. It's fantastic. And we also happen to have a conflict mitigator in the room, a trained conflict resolution expert. And I always joke that sometimes people walk out. These are not easy discussions, but sometimes it's not the faith leaders. Sometimes scientists walk out too, and that all of us come in with our identities and our attachments to our identities, right? It's not always the religious side that has a problem letting go. Our side does too. We are very attached to the vocabulary that we think gives us meaning, but also that gives us status, right? We have a language of our own, and it is an elitist language. We're very attached to it. That is not how you communicate with communities of faith, but that is not how you communicate with evangelicals. So one of the most fascinating conversations that happened in last year's gathering is we had a pastor from Kentucky that just said flat out, when I hear a scientist give a fact and then immediately say, but that does not mean, or immediately negate it or come up with, what we think is good science, which is, this is what we know right now. What he hears is uncertainty. What he hears is that the scientist who's speaking is actually not confident. and about his facts, right? And so here is this fascinating cultural difference right here. You have a scientist who thinks he's communicating in the most responsible way he can, doing good science. And you have this faith leader who is hearing, actually, these people are not confident about what they are saying. So
And
how
the
do we
faith
bridge
leader,
that?
right, and the faith leader has absolute faith in his facts,
Yes,
in his
that's
ideas.
right. And that is what they trust. They actually, what they want from us is a black and white thing, right? They want us to say, 100% we know this. We're not debating it.
Ah.
No scientist worth their salt will ever make that statement, right? So it's sort of, I think one of the fascinating things that comes out of this kind of dialogue and this kind of bridge building is we get to stop othering the other group. And we
Right.
get to really find what we have in common. We get to build on what we actually agree on and not spend time focused on what we disagree on. And one of the techniques we use is we drop a lot of the climate language. We just focus on disasters. We talk about, we really just talk about, well, let's talk about what is ahead. What are we seeing in terms of disaster projections? Which areas are going to be hit? And nobody walks away from that conversation. You know, everybody wants to know, are the people they love vulnerable, right? How do they protect the people they love? Typically, once that convening is over, we get to stay with them for a year. So every year we have a cohort and we're in touch with them on a monthly basis. We have professors at UW that will be present in those monthly meetings and sort of answer questions. And I'd say about half of them go on to do projects in their congregations. But, you know, I've often talked about this project and people have a lot of curiosity about this project. And I always joke, you know, here's a Himalayan heathen and has built this bridge and gets to work with evangelicals. Nobody else gets to sit back in America and say those people cannot be reached. If I can do it, right? Anyone can. And so for me, the real value of this project is not the numbers, because in reality, we've worked with maybe 150 faith leaders, right, in the evangelical community. The real value of this project is its modeling power. It is that we've developed this technique. We have this partnership. You know, the partnership is with the World Evangelical Alliance, with Arasha, which is one of the big evangelical environmental groups, and with other pastors and leaders. And so if we have this blueprint, anyone can apply this blueprint, right? We are in a time, and our society is so fractured and polarized that we cannot afford to sit back and other the people next to us who happen to live next to us. We cannot sit back and be complacent about that.
You're absolutely right. We cannot afford to other others. So, or we cannot afford to other sisters and brothers. We can't, if you call them others, we've already othered them. So actually that's it. You know, it's interesting. If you don't want to, our language is such a trap. So we should eliminate other from the language.
That's right.
So why do the evangelicals apply to or agree to be part of the program?
A lot of them come, I think, because they trust the leadership of the project. So I would say I'm very tangential in that leadership. My job is to be invisible during that whole program. A lot of it, I think, is word of mouth now, where sort of they know what is happening. I do think it is working because we are at a public university and there is more trust with public universities. And a lot of it is because it's confidential, right? There is no repercussion, there is no fear, there's no judgment. What I do see is that often it is not the scientists that change the minds of folks. It is other pastors, it is their peers. So in many ways, it's almost like we are creating this space for folks to come in and really be with one another. And it comes back to joy and communality, right? Where they feel safe, they feel they belong. And we have also the scientists we work with, they are really well trained to work with evangelicals now. And some of them, you know, Jonathan Patz, for example, he's very famous public health expert, was part of the Nobel Prize winning IPCC team, right? So there are folks that really also know their stuff and are very comfortable being grilled. very comfortable being in the hot seat. And that makes a difference too. There's a lot of laughter in these meetings.
Joy, environmental joy.
Absolutely. It's
This
the
is
theme.
this is really part of the secret.
Yeah.
Um, so really the work that you're doing, if we're to sum it up in many ways, is to try and understand and give rise to the conditions of resilience.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think
And
it really is asking people to balance when they do resilience building, however they define it, balancing between how much you contribute to the attributes versus the conditions, right? And really asking people to see justice work as part of their inner work, that we
right.
cannot meditate our way out of systemic injustice. If I have a request to my fellow Buddhists, it is this: we are not meditating our way out of systemic injustices. We have to embody and show up.
And just then to pick on your original point, so there's inner resilience we have to develop that has to become social or collective societal resilience.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is where the evangelicals are quite strong. They're very
Absolutely.
strong in building communities. So what's interesting is their communities, which are often very deep communities of care and mutuality and support and of a common worldview. So there's lessons to learn from them on how to build resilient communities. And do you see that ever get supported and transmitted?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, when I realized I was going to create that program at WWF, the Sacred Earth program, one of the reasons why I pushed for it so hard was because, FEMA leaves, right? All the disaster folks leave eventually, and it's the faith leaders and faith institutions that continue to stay. So when we are talking about, resilience in the context of post-disaster recovery, really the people that we need to be investing in are faith leaders and faith institutions. And when that became really clear to me because of Aceh in Southeast Asia. And what I found was that ultimately, ironically, they are the ideal partner for environmentalists, even though we may not see that, right? Because here is a group of self-selected people who have chosen a vocation because they care so deeply for their fellow human beings. Now, how they interpret that might be different, but that core motivation is exactly the same thing that drives us environmentalists, right? And the self-selected group of people have embedded themselves in community in a way where they have access to manpower, human power. Many of them, in very practical terms, you think about, you were talking about Ladakh and the Himalayas, all those monasteries, they have kitchens that feed large groups of people. They are comfortable sourcing large amounts of food. Old people stay in their places. They have young kids in their places, right? When we think about resilience and climate collapse in the context of climate collapse, to me, the very natural partner that environmentalists need to be working with and disaster folks need to be working with are faith leaders, because they actually practically have so many of the tools we need. And I would say that environmentalists in general, we are the last group that woke up to this reality, because actually what I started seeing was that during the AIDS epidemic, a lot of the health organizations had figured this out and were already working with faith leaders, and we are the ones who have been the holdout for a long time.
So one last question, which is, so we've discussed inner resilience, we've discussed social resilience. Is it possible to scale this to society? So what's so interesting is the consumption was scaled really through what I would call a colonial effort of consumption of the large corporations, global corporations colonizing our minds and our habits. So we don't have that power, but can we create a global movement of an interdependent, resilient, socially just consciousness?
I think we are. I really do believe we are. You know, one of the fascinating things and very difficult things right now about what's happening in Palestine, what is happening in the Congo, in Sudan, right? All these places is that what I see is young environmentalists in particular do not see that as separate things that are happening out there in the world. They see it as an interconnected kind of a group of decisions that are happening in an interconnected way, right? That uphold the status for some of us and require the subjugation of the rest of us, right? That if I'm not using the othering language, I'm trying to match it. And so I do think we're waking up to seeing that. And I do think the sort of the cognitive dissonance can go only for so long before it breaks, right? And we just sort of give up trying to make sense out of this. We give up trying to make sense out of things being easy and things being black and white and there being good guys and bad guys and, you know, the consistency of a good guy and a bad guy narrative, right? We're humans, we're so complex, you know? And what that means is that maybe what all of us are relearning to do is invest in the relationships that actually exist in our lives in the moment and not necessarily be so far out there that it all becomes conceptual and none of it is actually embodied in a way in our real lives on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that is one of the big challenges. And I do see that happening all around the world, not just in the US or not just in North America, but I've seen this happening everywhere. And, you know, I think it's fascinating to me that one of the things that I'm really excited about is how people are getting more and more comfortable talking about post-growth, right? That growth as this ideal is now really questionable. I mean, it was impenetrable in the 90s.
Right.
You could never question.
By the way, it was impenetrable until probably the global financial crisis. So
right?
It's still there. By the way, one of the things that drives me nuts is that you'll read about China or Japan or places, Germany, that are having population decline.
Yeah.
And even the most liberal economists, you know, good guy, want to make the world a better place. Oh my God, their population is declining, their growth is going to decline. And my sense is that I'm praying for a world of a lower population. If we can get there by natural means versus by death and destruction, how wonderful. I mean, they should be celebrating. They should be saying, China's negative population growth means that it's actually going to be maybe be able to live within its resources and create a circular economy and you know, have more equitable distribution anyway.
Well, I think the challenge with that is then the assumption is that it's the population growth that's driving all of this, right? But the reality is it's a handful of nations that really overconsume. We overconsume, you know, 100 times more than global South countries, right? So I think one of the things that I should say about joy that I absolutely love, it's like one of the secrets that's embedded inside joy is the funny thing about joy is that it has to be shared to experience it. The moment you experience it, you want to share it, right? Like, isn't that amazing that we experience it and our instinctive reaction is to want to share that? And the thing I love about that is that it is so not capitalistic, Jonathan. It is like the secret weapon against capitalism, right? Which is here is this experience that cannot be bought and it multiplies in the sharing of it. Right. And so when we think about non-capitalist ways, right, non-capitalist methods, non-capitalist goals, here is a practice that allows us to reclaim our sense of well-being, rebuild community, trust relationships that we have and invest in that, and then do it in a way that really sort of throws the middle finger at capitalism. It couldn't get better.
That's fantastic. Thank you. We're going to come to a close here. I wanted to note that your next appearance for the Garrison Institute is going to be on our Inner Transformation for Social Impact Leaders, a course that we're offering. And could somebody on our side put the link is just been put into the chat. It's got Dr. Keltner and a whole bunch of amazing people, and you are who will be teaching this course. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful and joyful, actually. This is like, you just listening to you laugh has made me more joyful. Talking about joy.
This is so great.
So
I know.
I hope all the audience felt the joy too. And to the audience, these forums are all free of charge, but we love donations. They bring us joy too. So please go to our website and click the donate button. It is sitting there unhappy, waiting to be joyfully engaged. Our next Pathways Planetary Health Forum will be with Kate Raworth and members of the Donut Economics Action Lab. And we're going to talk about how to create a regenerative and distributive society. It'll be on June 24th at 11 Eastern. So please join us for that too.
That is amazing. And that's amazing that Kate is the next speaker.
Yeah. So you should come.
I'm going to
come
tune in for that one for sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was lovely and joyful, and what a pleasure. Really had a lovely time.
It was wonderful to see you. Thank you. Peace to you and joy to everybody who's on the call. Bye.